Hey everybody, I'm Aaron Simmons. This is Philosophy for Where We Find Ourselves, December 11th, 2023. I hope you're doing well, and let me remind you that Camping with Kierkegaard, my new book that brings existential philosophy into engagement with my personal experiences in the mountains as an encouragement to you all to find joy in a world marked by despair, is available. So please go pick up a copy, link in the description below. Well, today what I want to do is think about continental philosophy of religion like we've been doing for the past few weeks, but I want to do it in a little bit more personal way. So this week I was actually honored to be a guest on the New Evangelicals Instagram account. I took over their account this past Friday for Open Line Fridays, and I answered over 40 different questions that came in the Ask a Philosopher section. So I thought, well, let's do the same thing here. And what I did is asked my own students in the philosophy of religion class that I taught this semester to submit questions that they had that were real, deep, important questions in their own lives that they thought a continental philosopher of religion might have something to say in response. So what I have are a few questions from my students, and I'm going to go through them. I'm going to give what I hope are at least plausible responses, certainly not as substantive or as comprehensive as I would like, but we're going to try to move through this in something of a continental philosophy of religion speed round. So please remember, I want to hear your questions. So drop in comments to this video and what are the questions you would like me to consider. And I would love to put a video together just responding to comments coming in from viewers. So thanks so much for watching. Let's dive in. All right, the first question, in your opinion, how do you know that God does or doesn't exist? All right, so my response to this is actually to interrogate the idea of knowledge. I actually think that when it comes to our relationships to the types of phenomena, the types of things that religion directs our attention, I think that typically knowledge is the wrong category. Now, I'm not suggesting that we can't have knowledge of something like God or religious phenomena. I just think that hope is a better framework. So for me, what I tend to say is I hope that God looks like Jesus. And what I mean by that is I'm speaking from my own particular religious tradition. And I'm not suggesting I hope everybody ends up being Christian. What I'm saying is I am invested in Christianity because the model of Christ is one that stands with the marginalized, the poor, the oppressed, and does so in a way that all of reality is actually inscribed in and defined by other-oriented love. So as far as I'm concerned, I hope reality is grounded in that kind of neighbor love as modeled by the person of Jesus presented to us in the Christian tradition. So that's what I tend to talk about. Now we can talk about long arguments regarding the existence of a greatest being, etc. And again, I teach all that stuff. But at the end of the day, I tend to find the most traction when I allow myself to lean into hope, into trust, rather than leaning into some sort of knowledge claim about what is the case. So it might be disappointing to some, but I do think that ultimately it speaks to the grounding existential dimension and dynamics that are in play when we talk about religion. Number two, what are some arguments for the infallibility of particular religious scriptures? Well, here I'm going to flip this question on its head and suggest that I believe infallibility or inerrancy are deeply disastrous hermeneutic commitments. I think that in general, more trauma and grief and power play is deployed in light of those commitments than not. And so I want to suggest the opposite thing, that abandoning a commitment to infallibility or inerrancy when it comes to religious texts actually invites a more substantive hermeneutic engagement with those texts. In other words, what is it that you hope to be the case? How are you then invested in living into that hope as presented in these narratives? This is not suggesting that there are not revealed texts. It's not suggesting that if there is a God in some sort of agential way, that the divine mind can't express God's self in words that could be taken up by religious believers. It's just to suggest that typically we are better off when we abandon claims to infallibility and instead live lives that invite others to read with us texts that are deeply complicated and invested in a kind of hermeneutic ambiguity. It takes work to decide what we understand these to mean, and I actually think that doing that work is an instance of deliberative neighbor love. Okay, so number 3. How do we understand faith or belief with the idea of God as dead? Well, I've talked a lot about the death of God on this channel. I've done videos on Nietzsche, on different hermeneutic frameworks. We've been talking the last couple weeks about Gianni Vattimo and his way of understanding the truth of Christianity as the performance of secularization as a cultural phenomenon. But in general, the death of God, I suggest, is not an atheistic thesis. It is instead a hermeneutic one. It's about the necessity of our interpretive responsibility. What will we say matters. What will we claim as the direction of our existential risk? Now, this is important because it actually allows us to understand the stakes of denying infallibility relative to religious texts. If the texts are not infallible and they're not inerrant, then this requires that we do work trying to figure out, well, what then will they mean for us today? So our final question simply asks, what do you think the future of philosophy of religion looks like? Here I'm going to follow my friend Kevin Schilbrack and suggest that there are 3 traditional biases that have been kind of blind spots in the history of philosophy of religion. And for me, the future of philosophy of religion is most pronounced, it's most likely to flourish if we overcome these 3 things. They are narrowness, in the sense that we are almost exclusively interested in classical theism and primarily Christian versions of classical theism in the history of philosophy of religion. 2, that philosophers tend to be kind of insular when it comes to their conversation partners. And so philosophers of religion almost always talk only to other philosophers rather than talking to a broad discursive community consisting of historians and sociologists and cognitive scientists and linguists, all working in various ways in relation to the academic study of religion. And 3rd, Schilbrack suggests that philosophy of religion has traditionally been too cognitivist. It's been focused on belief to the exclusion or dismissal of practice. So the opposite of those 3 things is what I would hope for the future of philosophy of religion, that it would be more globally invested, more globally hospitable and engaged, a variety of cultural traditions that are considered religious in various ways. The very question of what counts as religion becomes a more important question for philosophers. I think that's important. But secondly, I think that in order to do that, philosophers are going to have to talk to a lot of other scholars. And this is where there's not a sort of supremacy and hierarchy of who's at the top of this scholarly pile. But instead, it's that we are at the discursive table thinking and encouraging each other forward in relationship to a topic and phenomenon that is far more complex than any one discourse could possibly make sense of. And 3rd, I think that it's important that philosophers continue, as they certainly are increasingly doing, they continue to look at ritual, at liturgy, at embodied practice, at even embodied cognition, that maybe the way we know, the way we hope, the way we trust is itself a kind of embodied expression of who we are and the kinds of beings that we are given our bodies in the world. So there you go. Some very big, deep questions, all of which would require multiple books to try to think through at any level of adequacy. But there's my speed round sort of initial replies to these important questions offered by my students. Please drop a comment in. Let me hear your questions so that I can try to create content that is responding to where it is you find yourselves. All right, I'll see you next time, unless a piano falls on our heads.